So hopefully everybody is coming online.
A few nice familiar faces.
Yes, indeed. It's nice to see friends come back and listen to us talk about wine and watch us taste wine and hopefully taste wine alongside. Good evening, everybody. We've got a few more people coming in, I'm sure, but we'll get started now around 7 o'clock. For those of you who have not tuned into one of our sessions here at Nyetimber before, my name is Stefan Griffiths, brand ambassador at Nyetimber. You may have seen me talking about all things Nyetimber over the last few weeks. Tonight, I will not be doing the majority of the talking, as I am joined by my two esteemed guests. I'm just going to spotlight them here. First of all, Brad Greatrix, who is the winemaker here at Nyetimber. And we're also joined from Zurich. We are joined by Marc Almert, sommelier extraordinaire. And we will be talking this evening, well, Brad and Marc will be talking basically about the similarities and the interest between these two extremely similar positions in the wine trade, but of course lots of different things to talk about and to cover. Particularly for the benefits of those of you who, again, haven't joined us on one of these sessions before. Just a few words of sort of logistical admin. You might have noticed we will be recording this session, which is for the benefit of anybody who wants to watch it again, or quite a few people who are unfortunately unable to join tonight but want to catch up. So if anybody has any concerns about that, then feel free to turn off your cameras or rename yourselves. That's not a problem. We've also muted everybody apart from the speakers tonight, because with a few dozen people all talking, there's quite a lot of background noise. But we definitely do want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts, we want to hear your opinions, and most importantly, we want to hear any questions that you might have for Brad or for Marc, or anything really that is related to Nyetimber, to wine, to the world of the sommelier. So the best way that we're going to be doing that is I'll be playing sort of host in that regard. So what you can do is at the bottom of the screen, there is the chat function there. And if you use the chat function to message me, Stefan, directly, send in your questions as and when you have them. And at the end of the session this evening, we're going to have a good few minutes of Q&A with Marc and Brad and cover as many of those topics as possible. The way that most of these sessions have gone is we've been inundated with questions. So if there are any good questions that we don't get to tonight, rest assured we will cover them at some point in the near future. We will get the information out to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I will hand over to Brad and to Marc to introduce themselves properly. Just a brief word about Marc, because particularly those of you who are tuning in from the UK may not be as familiar with Marc as you are with myself or Brad. Marc is actually the world's best sommelier, voted in the ASI 2019 Sommelier Awards. So we're joined by a very esteemed member of the wine trade. Marc himself, a fan of Nyetimber, a great fan of Nyetimber, and in fact in his selections last year in the selections of the company that Marc works for, the Baolac wines, Nyetimber was selected, specifically the Classic Cuvée was selected as his sparkling wine pick of the year, which was the only sparkling wine in the world to be selected. So obviously we were quite happy about that and delighted to have Marc with us this evening to talk a little bit more about it. So perhaps if I hand over to you, Marc, to have a little bit of an introduction about yourself, and then likewise over to Brad, and then we will get the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for words of introduction, and thank you for all of you joining us. I see some familiar faces, both from Germany and from Switzerland, but also from other countries, so good to see you all. I hope you all brought something along to drink, hopefully a Nyetimber, and we'll be enjoying some on the side. So first of all, cheers to everybody. Good to see you. And yes, as Stefan mentioned, I'm based in Zurich in Switzerland. As you can hear, I'm from Germany originally, but I've been in Switzerland now for 3.5 years, working as a sommelier for the Baolac, which is a classic hotel in Zurich and also has its own wine trade and shop company called Baolac Vin, which are the Swiss importers for Nyetimber. And as a sommelier, you very often get asked what kind of wine regions are interesting now, what's happening in the wine world. And to me, English sparkling wine has really been one of the categories which has moved a lot in the last couple of years. And we'll be discussing that tonight. And Nyetimber being one of the pioneers is really one which I think is a great example for that. And I think is really interesting to discover. And I'm actually quite curious to have a long chat with Brad tonight, because I know he's very, very busy. And Brad, I believe we will hear in a couple of seconds that you're not from the UK. So maybe you want to explain how you came to work at Nyetimber and what you do.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Stefan. And yes, indeed, I'm well, thrilled to be here tonight. Looking forward to our conversation. I have huge admiration for sommeliers and what they do. And obviously, Mark, you're right at the very top of the tree in terms of sommeliers. And Stefan mentioned, you mentioned in your intro how similar the two professions are. I think the number of, if I had, a pound for every time someone, I tell them I went to enology school and they said, oh, to become a sommelier, I probably wouldn't need to work for a living. But actually, winemaking and the sommelier work quite different. Obviously, we both pivot around wine, but I think the way we approach things, the way we taste, the way we talk about them, quite different. So I'm looking forward to getting into that with you tonight, Mark. But yes, indeed, for people who are new to Nyetimber or not attended one of our events before, thinking into this English sparkling wine, to listen about this English sparkling wine from the winemaker, you might be surprised by my accent. Indeed, I was born in Canada and trained as a winemaker, and by default, I suppose looking back now, almost lazy thinking on my part, kind of I thought I'd end up making wine in Canada after my training and travels and things like that. But tasting a bottle of Nyetimber changed everything for me, like it maybe has for some other people. But I've gone a little bit further than most. That tasting a bottle of Nyetimber and the potential that it had and the qualities led me to get in touch. And I'm making a long story very, very short, but got in touch to say how good I thought the wine was. And 3 weeks after that first shot in the dark contact was my first day at work, and living on the west coast of Canada at the time and upending and moving effectively halfway around the world, and not just me on my own. For those that aren't as familiar, my wife also works with me. Her name will come up often tonight, probably Sherry Spriggs. But she's the head winemaker at Nyetimber. We work together, and so tasting that bottle together and making contact with Nyetimber changed everything for us. And now here we are, 13 years later.
And if I understood correctly, I believe it's the first time you actually made sparkling wine, no? Because I saw you worked in loads of interesting wine regions and interesting wineries, but I think this is actually the first sparkling position you have, no? Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, it surprises some people, but we had been kind of peripherally around sparkling, involved in some base wine making, particularly in New Zealand. But it was our first, start to finish sparkling winemaking. But the fundamentals are all the same. Tasting the grapes, you need to have ripe and balanced grapes. Ripe and balanced grapes gives you balanced juice. Balanced juice turns into nice wine, and on it goes down the chain. So there were some practical things that we had to get some on-the-job training pretty quickly. Never disgorged a bottle before, but Sherry and I, just in the way that we work, we don't do things in half measures. So we really threw ourselves completely into the world of sparkling. And anyways, we loved it as our most favorite style of wine, ever since we've been interested in wine. So our awareness was pretty good coming in.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it's your favorite style of wine, because I worked in Germany for the majority of my career so far. And Germany is actually the country which has the highest sparkling wine consumption per capita in the world, So they're very curious to always discover different sparkling wines, and that's also why I'm always curious to discover new sparkling wines, which I think English sparkling wine still is, despite being around for 30 years. I think it's only that in the last couple of years we've really seen a lot this side of the channel. But I think, to me, I always marvel at sparkling winemakers, because I imagine it's very difficult to taste base wines and reserve wines, and then a bit like a chef creating a dish, you have to make a cuvée not only from different parcels, but also from different vintages. And whether you made the right decision, you sometimes only find out 10 or 15 years later. How do you deal with that? Because to me, like, I do my evening service in the restaurant, and then at 11 p.m. it's finished, and I know whether I had the right decision or not, but I imagine it's very different for you.
It does demand a lot of patience, and used to joke with Sherry about, it's great for job security when you start at a sparkling winery, because you can be toiling away for 5 or 7 years just shoving your bottles into the cellar, and nobody gets to taste them until you've been at it for quite a while. But I think if we link back to what I was saying earlier about some of the differences between winemakers and sommeliers, I think one of the things that I really admire about the sommelier palate and the way that you approach wines is how you can describe flavors so precisely and so articulately, and then link them into food and link them into the experience of things. With sparkling wine, we almost go at the opposite end of the spectrum. So when we're tasting young wines, it's not so much trying to understand, if we're tasting red fruit flavors in a young base wine, for example, it's not so much that we're worried about, is it, what type of cherry or what's the expression of strawberry, is it ripe strawberry or not, in terms of the flavors we're perceiving, because we know that those flavors are not going to be still, a main part of the wine 3-5 years down the track, by the time we allow for aging in bottle and the influence of lees, post-dispersion aging, etc. So what we really pay attention to, especially tasting juice and especially tasting young wines, is the shape and the structure and the texture and balance. So really the foundation of the wine, and those things are that if a wine is balanced, if a wine has structure and length early in its life, it carries those properties with it all through its life. And a nice coincidence, I guess, or the power of nature, is that wines that are balanced tend to evolve in a nice way and tend to bring nice flavors along with them. So, it is true, tasting juice, tasting early fermentations, what we're perceiving is quite different. You wouldn't recognize, partially fermented base wine compared to a bottle of Nyetimber that we're tasting now. But the fundamentals are there, and you have to just trust that. Look after what you can as a young wine, and it will go in a way that it will go in a positive way.
And I think it's also very much of an acquired taste, tasting base wines for sparkling wines. I was once in a workshop where we got to try to make our own blend. We had the finished product, and then we had several échantillons, so tasting samples, and we, as sommeliers, tried to create the wine, how they blended it. And I think when people taste sparkling base wine for the first time, it's always so tart and so unusual compared to other wines. I think it's very challenging to taste.
Yeah, it is tricky because everything, one of the things that I love about it is that all the flavor, the intensity, everything is turned, the volume is turned way down. So you really have to pay attention to all the nuances, and you really have to be on your toes, so to speak, with the winemaking, because everything is so subtle. It's easy just to upset the balance. It's easy to leave footprints so to speak. So you have to work very carefully. But I do find not so much that the people struggle to appreciate the wines. I think good base wines taste good. People can recognize them as good, but differentiating between them is more difficult if you're not used to that world. But it's only really a question of experience, I think. Just putting the miles in. It's a rare thing to get to taste base wines. Even more rare, kind of at that raw state like you're working with when you're trying to put together a blend. And actually, people, so when we have visits occasionally at Harvest, I'm at the pressing center. So we get I do juice tastings when people come and see us, and it tends to be that people who are new to sparkling, they tend to actually like the pressings, you know, the things where there's a little bit more tannin, more flavor intensity. Actually, not as good for sparkling. The juice that I'm kind of thinking we're gonna maybe send off on a track so that it won't end up in the finished wine. But because the flavors are stronger, a little bit more obvious, those are the ones that, and the acidity is lower. Those tend to be the wines that people go for. And I think that's sort of a trend with sparkling. As you come into sparkling, you like the wines that are more like still wines. Stronger flavors, more intensity, more body, and then the longer you spend in the sparkling world, you start to look for more finesse and elegance once you tune into the lower volume.
And I think I don't know how you feel on this, but to me, it's really interesting to watch myself, how my taste or tasting skills also develop, because I think it's a continuous journey. And I think all of us, especially you as a chef de cave, but also as sommeliers, go about it on the one hand quite technically, going through structure and all the things you need to say in a classic tasting. But to me, a big change was when I moved to Zurich. I was since then I work with Aurélien Blanc, who's with us tonight too. He's actually from Burgundy, but is now the best sommelier of Switzerland and works with us in the restaurant as our restaurant manager. And the first time we tasted was like two worlds clashing, because being French, he's much more emotional when tasting than I was. I was always quite analytic. And then we slowly moved towards one another. And since then, I've adapted my tastings a little bit to actually let my heart speak a little bit too, because I think that's very important when you taste wine, whether it's wine or sparkling wine, that you actually also have an analytical approach to it, but also let it touch yourself when it is exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a really important way to look at wine and to look at sparkling wine as well. That there is, and it's actually one of the reasons Sherry and I love sparkling wine so much, is there is a technical side to it. We met as biochemistry students, so you know, science background. We just love wine, but also, you know, we're not technicians. We're actually, rewinding back to when we arrived at Nyetimber, we went completely against the grain and completely how things are being operated. Where Harvest decisions until we arrived was, you take a sample of grapes into the lab and you squish them and you measure the sugar and you measure the acidity, and if the sugar is high enough and the acidity is low enough, you pick. And Sherry and I like, no, stop, wait, what do they taste like? And you know, even the consultant we were working with at the time is, what do you mean, what do they taste like? You know, this is sparkling. You process it. What I love about sparkling wine is that fusion between the artistic side, the tasting side, the emotion. Also for communicating, I completely agree. You know, as a sommelier, being able to communicate on the passionate side, not just this many grams of dosage and this much percentage Chardonnay. But sparkling, you can't shake the technical side, but you also need that passion, and it demands that artistry if you really want to go, you know, to the top level.
And I imagine it must be very interesting to work in England now making sparkling wine, because I think it's probably the country where it's the least regulated sparkling wine in the world at the moment. It's always my impression, because many other regions have so many laws, which then we sommeliers get to learn for an exam. But I guess it's quite cool that you can be part of this process and shape the future a little bit. And something I still struggle with, and I would be really interested to hear your opinion, is people always speak about English sparkling wine as one category, but I assume that in the different regions, I think you source from several counties from England too, you do have some differences in taste and profile of the wines and grapes. Could you maybe explain like what's different Sussex to Kent to Hampshire, whether you think we'll be seeing that on bottles and how they differ in the wine?
I mean, amazing question. I'm just in my mind thinking, okay, if I answer it fully, probably the next 2 hours are gone. I'll try and make a short version. So Yes, it's true that, just in terms of English sparkling wine and the regulations, things are, there's the foundation of quality sparkling wine production that applies. They're European law, and they're going to be rolled into British law once British law gets its own. Once British law is defined, but I'm not going to open that topic. So there's a foundation in terms of quality sparkling wine production rules that apply to Europe that we've adopted here, and there are some push for regulations to tighten and to become a little bit more specialized in a way that's recognizable for people that are used to the appellation type system. But we so far at Nyetimber have been a little bit not relaxed about the regulations. That's not the right word, but relaxed from pushing forward with regulations, because even though we're the pioneer, even though Nyetimber has been doing this for the longest in England, it's still there's a lot to learn and a lot to establish, and we're not in a rush to write things down in a way that this is the way, this is the recipe for English sparkling wine, because we might regret, putting the handcuffs on 10 years from now, as things evolve and change. We do have some things that we think we're England and Nyetimber is very good at, and we keep ourselves on a narrow path. We're not rushing to regulations. But the other side of that, the other part of your question is about the regions, and we do have vineyards in three different counties. We own all of the vineyards. For those of you tuning in that are less familiar with Nyetimber, we're 327 hectares of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and we own all of it. But it's actually split across 11 vineyard sites, and those 11 sites in three counties. Like with the regulations, where some people were interested to clamp down and start developing an appellation system in terms of production regulations, there is also regional interest in creating styles according to regions. For now, the only regions that we know of are counties. So there is already in progress. I don't think it's got the final stamp, but it's a long way down the path of being formalized an appellation for Sussex, which is if you grow your grapes in East or West Sussex and you comply with certain production regulations, you can apply Sussex on the label. But the thing, again, we, as speaking on behalf of Nyetimber, aren't rushing forward with this type of system, because while the boundaries are defined by counties, it doesn't give you a lot of information about wine quality, because yes, on a south-facing chalk or green sand slope in West Sussex at 80 meters above sea level, you could make sensational wines. But also in West Sussex, you could be on the north-facing slope at 250 meters with some strange trellising system, also qualify for being in West Sussex and nothing to do with wine quality. So our idea is let's let the regions, and now I'm talking about stylistic regions, develop themselves and not rush again to clamp things down. But there are some producers who have multi-county vineyards. We were the first, and across three counties have the best cross section, and we really are seeing differences across those three, but more to things that can be explained in the local area and in the soil than the fact that these grapes are grown in Hampshire. But all of our grapes are grown in the south of England. For international people tuning in from internationally, Hampshire, West Sussex, and Kent are all counties in the south of England, sort of halfway in terms of north-south. We're roughly halfway between London and the south coast, and kind of along that line. That's where our vineyards are situated. As you go further, so starting from the west, starting from Hampshire, pure chalk soils, at least where planted, slightly cooler, slightly longer growing season. And so what we get from those grapes, we have Chardonnay over there, very pure, elegant, perfumed wines that have a lot of shape and length. If we go over one county to the east. That's West Sussex. There we change soil type, so adds complexity to the story. But the wines, you see much more roundness, much more fruit intensity. The wines of and that's in a sparkling context, fruity in a sparkling context. But Nyetimber's first vineyards were planted on green sand in West Sussex, so our reputation is sort of forged on that style of wine, and we're adding in the chalk elements more recently. And then if we go to Kent, probably the warmest of the three counties and the warmest of the three sites where we have varieties, but on chalk. So we're going to have a combination of that shape and fruit flavors that we get from West Sussex, but also that line and minerality that we get from the chalk that we see in Hampshire. So three different expressions and complexity. Complexity of work, but also complexity in the wine only goes up, I think, as we get this.
It's probably worth mentioning at this point to everybody that we are actually tasting some of the aforementioned wine alongside, and the wine that we're all tasting together this evening has fruit coming from Sussex and from Hampshire, but not yet from Kent, because we haven't yet released a wine with any Kentish fruit. But the wine that we're tasting this evening, as Marc and Brad will know, is our classic cuvee, the signature wine of Nyetimber. Just bottle there for demonstration purposes. And yeah, I mean, the flagship wine of Nyetimber that I'm sure everybody who's familiar with Nyetimber is familiar with this wine. But Marc, you selected this wine when we had a discussion about which wine you wanted to talk about this evening, and what was it that led you to that?
Well, I think it's a great introduction to English sparkling wine, because it's really, I think, what you are most known for. And I think it's a good example that sparkling wine is often just seen as an aperitif, but this shows that it should be seen as a wine. And I think that's something people often have a misconception about, that you come to a restaurant, you have a sparkling wine, and then you drink something proper with your food. But I think it's something we can actually learn a lot from French still, because in France it's quite established to have a sparkling wine throughout your meal. And I think that's really fascinating. And I think if you would only drink this wine as an aperitif, it would be a shame. And I think it's actually really interesting to see how it develops in your glass throughout the course of an evening, and how you can pair it with different dishes. Because I think often sparkling wine is only paired with things like oysters or caviar, but it goes really well with slightly more strong dishes like some crayfish tartare, or also some classic meat. Even if you have a roasted quail's breast, I think this has enough nuttiness, has enough creaminess to live up to that. And especially if you have a bottle with a certain amount of bottle age already, it starts getting more of that brioche and nut flavor and becomes really exciting to pair with. And something I always like to do is probably not what people expect from a sommelier, but I really enjoy drinking sparkling wine with popcorn. And when you have like a truffled popcorn, I think this is a really outstanding match, and something different to try when you go to the cinema or open air cinema next time. But I don't know, Brad, do you have a favorite dish with your classic cuvée?
Well, I think I just love it's a well-worn pairing, but smoked salmon classic cuvée, absolutely love. And actually, the popcorn one is something right from when Sherry and I were first getting into sparkling wine and drinking champagne. It's popcorn as a treat, kind of an everyday snack with with a deluxe drink is yes, that's a nice pairing as well. The saltiness, it really connects. Lovely.
Yeah. And I think also if we start speaking about sparkling wine more as a wine, I think we can also change a little bit how people treat it, because very often sparkling wine to me is served in too small glasses, because I think especially a wine like this was aged on its lees for years. It has so much to develop, but only if you give it enough space. So I think it's always good to have a white wine shaped glass a little bit. And I think also to not drink it too cold, because I know that many always like drinking a sparkling wine really chilled on ice. So I think actually when you have it at a little warmer temperature at around like 8 degrees plus or minus, you get slightly more of those nuances and this finesse. And I think one thing that might be interesting to people that have a Nyetimber bottle with them is something I really like, because being somebody who learns for a lot of competition and a lot of exams, I'm quite geeky about wine, and I always want to find out what am I actually drinking. And I'm not sure that everybody knows that on Nyetimber, you can actually, on the back, there's a bottle code, and you can enter that into the website, and then you can find out. And the one I'm drinking tonight actually is based on 14, but then has 5 more vintages in it. And I think that's really fun to see, okay, what's the different blends? And then maybe if you have a different bottle another time, why is it different? And you can actually get a feel for vintages, despite it being a multi-vintage blend. I think you have a different vintage with you, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, I am one step ahead of you there, Mark, because Brad and I have the sort of super current release of this. So actually, I'm just to talk about, again, some people watching will be familiar with this, but as Mark has highlighted it, something we're always very proud of here at Nyetimber is giving as much information as we can on these wines. And if you go to our website and you go to nyetimber.com/wineinfo, as it says on the back of the bottle, you get the option here to put in that code. And if you do, assuming my Wi-Fi is still working, hey, we get this. So Mark, your version is based on the 2014 vintage, as you said, whereas what we've got here is based on the 2015 vintage. So we want to give as much information as possible about the blend of grapes, the blend of different vintages, and also these 3 dates down here, which have been on the back of Nyetimber bottles now for several years, and we've always been quite keen to include the bottling date, the disgorging date, but also the riddling date. And Brad, I think we still think we're the only people to have done that. Or certainly the first people that I've come across to put that on. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, definitely the first, and yeah, as far as I know, also the only ones so far. So, but for us, it's such an important feature of the evolution of a sparkling wine when you're getting into serious amounts of lees aging time, because the bottle effectively, resting on lees, you've got a large surface area of yeast in contact with the wine, and after riddling, you move the bottle to vertical position with the cap down, and the surface area in contact with the yeast shrinks quite significantly. So the evolution of the yeast flavors in the wine changes after it's been riddled, and it's disgorgement dates becoming ever more common, and I think there's lots of people now providing those. We were far from the first for disgorgement dates. Bottling dates, pretty rare at the time that we did it, but we were the only ones that were giving all 3, bottling, riddling, and disgorging. But for us, those 3 dates, because of each of them tells you something about the evolution of the wine and what you're experiencing in the glass in a way. It's like a 3-legged stool. You take one of those dates away and the other 2 are less useful. You really need the whole set in order to understand, that's a bit strong to say in order to understand what you're drinking, but it gives much more context to what you're experiencing.
I think, and Mark, you'll obviously know far more about this than I, but the impression I get from the normal wine drinker these days is that people want to know what they're drinking. And there is, there has been this element of mystery about wine and certain wines for a long time, but I think these days people there's so much more awareness of wine, there's so much more interest in wine, that this sort of thing, whether it's from Nyetimber or whoever producing wine, giving this information, I feel like people tend to appreciate that. Do you find the same in that kind of moment of being the sommelier? Do people want to sort of, what kind of information do they want to get there?
Definitely. I think in general, people are becoming much more curious and are demanding transparency in things they consume. We see that also for food, that people are becoming very aware of which supplies a restaurant is using, where exactly did the cattle grow that they're now enjoying. And I think it's great that wine is moving along those lines too, because it opens up for so much tableside conversation for us as a sommelier. Me coming from Germany, the majority of our guests are used to seeing grapes on a bottle, for example, and then when they get a wine which doesn't have, they're always curious to find out, okay, what is this actually that I'm drinking? And also in Switzerland, we see that sparkling wine is becoming much more known to people, and the more they know about it, the more details they want to know about it. And I think that's something we as sommeliers can always then narrate and say, okay, you try this, and this was based on this vintage, this was based on this vintage, can you find difference? And I think it's something which really opens a huge corridor of conversation, and is really, really crucial. And I think also with sparkling wine, there was always this notion that you need to drink a sparkling wine within the first 6 months after you buy it. But I think that now more and more people are actually deliberately cellaring their sparkling wine and buying a case of 6 and looking, okay, I have this base vintage, how does it develop in bottle even after it's released from the winery? And I think the guest usually would not know that if he didn't have the chance to find that out. And it's something we can engage more in conversation with our guests and guide them along that path.
I've heard one reason why producers might not put a disgorgement date actually on the back label is because they think that a consumer might confuse that for some sort of best before date or something like that. But I think it's much more sophisticated now, much more awareness around that, and I do find people asking about it, wanting to know about when the wine was disgorged, and they love the vintage breakdown as well that we provide on the wine info page for the multi-vintage wines. Vintage bottlings are Blanc de Blanc or Tillington, for example, 100% from a year, but to be able to taste and understand and see all the vintage components in a multi-vintage wine is interesting.
And something I wanted to ask you, early on you spoke about that our two jobs are quite similar in some aspects, even though we do very different things. And one of the things that to me is always very important, and it's one of the reasons why I went down the wine route, is history. And also I've always worked in quite traditional historic hotels. Like we are family run and run by the same family, the hotel, since 176 years, and also our wine shops. And I was very surprised when I had the first tasting of your prestige cuvée, the 1086, because then Stefan explained to me that it's from the Doomsday Book. And I actually went to a British school in Germany when I grew up. And then we had British history lessons, not German. So I learned about the Doomsday Book, which I believe is something where they wrote everything there is in England to see what's going on. But I was wondering, what inspires you when you make a new wine or a new blend? Is it history or is it art, or where do you take the inspiration from?
It's really about because there's sort of a thread running through our wines, or I hope. I mean, hopefully other people can see this and experience this too. But we own all of our own vineyards, as I mentioned earlier, and what inspires us is the landscape and the place that we as Nyetimber comes from. And expressing that in the wine. So, there are a lot of people in the world making sparkling wine. There's a lot of people growing Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. There's a lot of people, aging wine for 2, 3, 5 years on these. There's nothing distinctive about Nyetimber in that regard. We're in a small group by already going those steps, but still, it's less distinctive. But what people can't ever do is make a wine like us if we express our vineyards in the wine, unless you buy the sites off of us. Or I was going to make a joke about sneaking over the fence and taking some grapes, but I don't want to encourage that practice. But that's the way that we can make the most distinctive wine. So when we're putting blends together, when Sherry and I are assessing wines, we really want to see what is this year given us? What is it trying to tell us? How can we show 2015 or 2016 or 2014 the best? Or in the case of the multi-vintage blends, we have the opportunity to we have an idea what classic cuvee ought to be for Nyetimber and what the rosé multi-vintage ought to be. So we try to find the wines that help us bring that expression forward. But the history, so speaking, for example, growing up in Canada, the history at the Nyetimber estate, going all the way back to a written mention in the Doomsday Book of 1086, is just it's a great part of our story. It's not actually leading us through as an inspiration. And we're so fortunate to have that again as a distinctive feature that who else can mention that amount of history? Also, the ownership of the estate for a time by King Henry VIII. Just makes for a remarkable property.
Yeah, we are a bit younger. We have some products which are called 1844, but we make some 1844 chocolates and teas and wines and all kinds, and actually some honey also. But I think it's always a good, again, a tableside conversation, because I think as a sommelier it's so important that you don't just pour a wine, you actually speak about it and speak about its origin and what inspired people. And I think that's been fascinating, usually to travel and to see a lot of different countries and to try to understand the culture and the mentality in different wine regions and the food people eat with the wines within their region, and then to bring that back to your own restaurant and to explain it to the clients you have.
I was going to ask actually, because I'm fascinated about that side of things. That you'll have a menu that you're very familiar with, and wine list that you're very familiar with. But when it comes to pairing, and guests arrive and sit down at a table, and you're talking to them about the wines, how much can you use that sort of dialogue with them to influence the pairing that you give to them? How much is the food and the wine, and how much is the people?
To be honest, I think it's very important to have a good wine list, because then you have several options at hand. Because it's very much more about people often than actually the food and wine pairing. Food and wine pairing is something most people go for when they order a tasting menu, and then we have a tasting flight with that, which also includes sparkling wine, because I think it is the food wine too, not only an aperitif. And then you can really focus on the food and wine tasting, but the majority of people coming to the restaurant are looking for a glass of wine or bottle of wine, or maybe 2 bottles of wine, which they drink throughout several courses. And also maybe if it's a table of 4, different people have different food. And then I think it's very interesting, because it's probably the part of our job which is the most fascinating, but at the same time the most difficult, because you only have a couple of seconds and a couple of questions where you can find out, okay, what's the occasion tonight? Are you here to celebrate your wedding day? Are you here for a business lunch? Are you in Switzerland the first time, or have you been to our restaurant 100 times already? And then you try to take in all that information and ask 1 or 2 pointed questions, like what do you usually drink, what do you feel like tonight, and then try to come up with the wine that fits that situation, that food order, and that group of guests in front of you. And yes, it is probably the most interesting thing we do. And I think it's more fun even if you know the guests a little bit, if they're regulars of the restaurant, because then you get to know their tastes along the years. I mean, my colleague Aurelia has worked here since almost 12 years, so 3.5, I'm still beginning. But already we know some guests quite well and know, okay, last time, Brad, you had this wine and you had this food. Maybe this time you want to try this. I think that's also the easiest way to convince them to try something new, because English sparkling wine is not something on the top of people's minds. So it's something which you need to introduce a little bit and to motivate people to try. If you know they're into other sparkling wines, then this might be a new opportunity for them to dive into.
Amazing. And you've Stefan mentioned in the intro, but your success as a sommelier is unmatched, I think, in terms of awards. The current world champion, so to speak. How did you get into this competitive side into sommelier competitions?
To be honest, when I was getting into it, I was forced into it, because I was working in a restaurant in the Rheingau in Germany, which is very famous for its Rieslings. And I had a really great head sommelier who taught me all the tricks of the trade, basically. It was my first sommelier assistant position. And then he said, after 2 years working with me, he said, it's great that you're enjoying wine, but you should become a bit more serious and you should start doing competitions and exams. And I said, well, now it's getting serious and I need to invest some free time, and it's not all just fun and joy. And then actually he inscribed me to a young sommelier competition, and he helped me train for it. And I was a bit going out of the blue for it, and I managed to do the 2nd place. And 1 year later, the same competition happened again, and the prize was to go to the international finals in Adelaide. And I had never left Europe before that. So I was like, okay, this can be fun, actually. If you sit down and actually invest some work, you can get some really amazing experiences. And then Adelaide was my first international competition from the Chain Rotisseur. I think we have them too in the UK. And I think actually that year someone from the UK won. And then I was kind of hooked, and I started doing more exams and more competitions. And it's like a snowball. Once you start, you can't really stop. And it was really fun because it made me discover a lot of different wines, but also made me discover a lot of great people, because also training for an international competition, you often train with others from other countries. And the German Sommelier Association helped me a lot and helped organize some trainings and coachings with people from all over the world. And there was even one coaching in Canada called Som 360. We had a chance to go to Japan to watch a competition there. And that way, the competitions really, they were the necessary evil, let's say, but there were so many beneficial things from encountering people, encountering new cultures, and tasting new wines and spirits and beers that really made it fascinating, and something I actually now miss because I don't do any competitions anymore. But I still do the odd exam once in a while. And it's good to keep you on your toes, because I guess you have the same. If you start learning about wine, it's a bit like Alice going into Wonderland. Every corner you meet something new, fascinating, and you want to continue with this discovery, because I think something all wine people, whether they're making wine or selling wine or drinking wine, have in common is curiosity. But I know that before you went to England, you went on quite a big trip of the world too. I saw you worked in several countries. Is there one which you say that left quite a mark on you, or something which really had a great impression for you?
They all did in a way, because it was so we did biochemistry degrees, as I mentioned, and then a master's degree at a wine research institute in Canada. But that's, wearing a white lab coat, studying, little 1 liter fermentations, and then realizing that's a bit too academic and we want to get to the practical side. So we moved to Australia, to Adelaide, and studied enology at Adelaide University. But then that was, there's only so much you can learn about winemaking from books. You can learn an amazing amount from books and lectures, but you can't read, how to put together a blend or when to pick a grape. So we set off on this, what I call, our self-imposed internship, doing harvests around the world, working for different winemakers to experience the more artistic side of things. Willing to scrub, clean, stack, move, pack, whatever you want me to do, and in exchange, I just want to be able to, talk to you and share ideas and experience that side of wine. And so every place that we went, as we worked in twice in Australia, McLaren Vale and Hunter Valley, Central Otago in New Zealand, Oregon, and then I had the opportunity to go to Chateau Margaux in France. And all of them were deliberately chosen, for a reason. In some cases, really our artistic side of things, or the place I worked in Oregon was very more on the technical side, so splitting things out into small fermentation, 1 clone, 1 rootstock, 1 10 fermentation. But actually, I've mentioned some of those words already tonight, so the influence is sort of slipping out, or it's in my consciousness, is Chateau Margaux, which is a place where I went. I was there for the harvest of 2006, and for a few months, and I got to work with Paul Pontellier, who's since passed away. But I was expecting when I got there, right? Here's this young guy, and he can just stay over there. He can stay over there in the corner, and once in a while we'll go talk to him. But I was welcomed so warmly and brought right into the middle of the production team. The information, discussions with anybody I wanted, tasting through all the vats, going out in the fields, in the vineyards, tasting grapes with Paul Pontellier and Philippe Pascal, who back then was the technical director. Now he's the general manager, taking over from Paul Pontellier. And the reason I was able to do all that, Paul Pontellier said to me one day, he said, look, until you own these vineyards, you're never going to be able to copy Chateau Margaux. So if you want to know, what the pH of this block of Cabernet is, 2 days before harvest, knock yourself out. I had keys, for a short time in my life, I had keys to the barrel cellar at Chateau Margaux, which is a nice honor, pretty exclusive club, I guess. And I think that just confidence in your vineyards is something that, you know, it's stamped in my conscience now.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry to, I do not want to interrupt this at all, but I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and we've had quite a few questions come in for our Q&A session. So I thought maybe let's do, Marc, if you've got one last question now, and then we'll move on to the Q&A and cover as much as we can then.
It's not really a question. I just find it fascinating because much of what Brad said is actually the same for the restaurant industry. Is you need people to be willing to share their knowledge. And to me, I always had the luck to work with restaurant managers. I had sommeliers when I was still an assistant to that taught me a lot. You need to have that openness to do every job at the restaurant and not just walk around showing off fancy bottles, but actually do the cellar work, do the paperwork. And that way you learn so much that brings you forward. And I think it's great if you do that from an international perspective. And I just wanted to finish before we go to the Q&A. I will never forget Adelaide because it was the most bizarre sparkling wine I ever tasted. In the Adelaide town hall, they gave us sparkling Shiraz, which I think in Adelaide is quite common. But outside of Adelaide, I haven't ever seen, and I'm not too sad I haven't ever seen it again.
Yeah.
I guess you drank that at university.
Yeah. It's I think a rite of passage there.
So Stefan, what questions can we answer?
Firstly, thank you very much to you both. I have the same, it's not really an issue, but I could talk about wine and listen to people talk about wine for hours and hours and hours. But I think if I did that tonight, Sherry would never forgive me. So let's move on to the Q&A. So we've actually had a few questions come in advance of the session, plus some really good questions that have come in during this evening. So I'm going to start. We've actually had a few questions come in from David, who is in Palma, Mallorca, fellow sommelier, I believe, Marc, David Delago.
Yep, used to be in Zurich.
He sent in a few really good questions that I just wanted to put to you. So the first one is for you, Marc, is how would you convince classic champagne drinkers to try a wine, to explore a wine like Nyetimber?
I think basically the best way to discover a new wine is to give it to the guest to taste. And for example, we have a tradition of when we have our tasting menu for New Year's Eve, we always start with a sparkling wine as aperitif, but also to go with the first one or two small greetings from our Chef Laurent Apperon. And last year, we actually started with a Blanc de Blanc from Nyetimber. And there were quite a couple of surprises. And I never started New Year's Eve with an English wine. But when they then taste it, they really enjoy it. And I think that's the best way to do it. You just need to find a good pairing, a good situation, and then you can do it. Or we also opened a new restaurant recently, the Bauers, which is our brasserie. And there we have something called the Winery of the Month. And there we also had Nyetimber for the opening month to celebrate. And that way people see it in the wine and like, hey, I never tried this. Give me a taster. And I think you always need to have that taster available.
No, totally right. I think a second question, and this is actually something that I think both of you briefly sort of touched on earlier, and this is sort of to, I guess, to both of you now, regarding the aging of sparkling wines. David says there are many different opinions, which is, yeah, that's putting it lightly. Some people saying that it can be enjoyed straight after disgorging. Others say that it can improve with time. And in my experience, people who won't even approach a sparkling wine until it's 20 years old. So what are your views on the subject? And specifically with regards to Nyetimber, so both inside and outside. Maybe Brad, if you want to answer first.
So yeah, it's a good question, and as Marc mentioned earlier, there is a lot of perception that, you know, among people that sparkling wine is wine you need to pull the cork as soon as you get it home. I don't think that's true on this audience tuning in tonight, but just speaking wider. But it's really down to personal taste, I think. So wines, there's sort of it's an extra phase of aging that a sparkling wine goes through. So you have aging and vinification while the wine's in tank, then you bottle it, and you have a phase 2 of the aging in contact with the yeast, and then phase 3 is how the wine evolves after it's been disgorged. And I think personally, just saying, my own rules, I would always give it at least 3 months. I think 6 months is a nice entry point. You're starting to get, some of the wines relaxed now from the discourse experience, and starting to develop a nice richness. But then from there until, as you said, Stefan, 20 years, if you like that style of wine where it's gone a little bit more, spicy, dried fruit, rich, the acidity is seemingly softer. Anywhere on that continuum from 6 months to 20 years, wherever you like it. And using things like the wine info page, you can start to zero in on that. Up until now, disgorgement dates have been hidden inside a black box, so you don't really know what you're getting when you pull the cork. And hopefully now, with more transparency by everyone, people can zoom in a little bit on their personal taste.
The pun throughout the night.
Sorry, yeah, it was too late. By the time I spotted it, it was already in midair.
Yeah, the cat's out of the bag. Thank you, Brad. Marc, would you sort of say the same?
Yeah, I think it depends what you expect from your sparkling wine. If you see it more as an aperitif, then probably you will get that feeling more when you have a wine which is more recently disgorged. But especially vintage styles, like Tillington, for example, single vineyard, or the 1086, they really benefit from bottle aging. But I think it's important to know then they become more vinous because they lose some of their perlage, some of their carbon dioxide. You get more of those wine flavors and more of those tertiary aromas. And to me, that's very, very fascinating to see that process. But I know that some people, when they order a sparkling wine and then they get something which has next to no bubbles left, which only happens if you really age it for like 25, 30 years, and can be a very unusual experience. But it's really, to me, it's a great experience and you should try it at least once.
Definitely. I mean, those of you listening who are, again, Nyetimber fans might know that we keep back bottles of pretty much every wine that we make, and we still have some 1992 Blanc de Blanc, the first wine ever made at Nyetimber and then the first of its kind in England. And we don't exactly crack open a bottle every Friday, but we do keep an eye on the wine, and it's fascinating just how well that wine has aged. And as you say, Marc, that there's a different expression of the fruit and all that sort of thing, but it's still alive, it's still fresh, and I think it's generally slightly underestimated how well these wines can age. The third question, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a time to think about this. So I'm going to ask you the question, then we'll come back to it at the end. So David asks, he says, if you have to choose one song to describe, he's asked the classic cuvee, the Blanc de Blanc 2013 and Tillington, but maybe for tonight, let's just think classic cuvee, the wine that we have in glass. If you had to choose one song to describe the classic cuvee, what would it be? So have a think. We'll come back to that at the end. I'll give you some time to. We don't want to put you on the spot too much.
Does this game have the phone a friend option?
The friends you have are myself and Marc. So let's ask the audience. Actually,
Yeah.
You can shout to Sherry if you mute your microphone, Brad. See what she says. Okay, so while you ponder that, question from Simon Scutts, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable people about Nyetimber in the world these days. Simon asks, he'd like to ask about the cellaring and the background for keeping examples of each year's vintage and how that feeds into production. And I assume what you mean there, Simon, is talking about sort of keeping the base wines, the reserves from each year that then feed into the multi-vintage wines. So if different, let me know. But if we'll go with that. So Brad, how does the reserve keeping sort of factor into, I guess, the winemaking?
So we, anyways, have a complex set of base wines that we're working with from a given harvest, because we keep all of our vineyard parcels separate. Well, we first of all, we identify a vineyard parcel. The parcel to us is a set of vines that gives some sort of distinctive flavor or texture. Once we recognize that, we'll harvest it separately, own tank, into its own tank, its own base wine, and then it becomes a blending component. So after harvest, we have 80, 100, whatever of these base wines to work with. But then reserve wines sit on, add a layer of complexity on top of that, because we have the wine, all those wines from the year, but then adjacent to that, we have this big collection of reserve wines that we've been keeping back from previous harvests. So every year, certain of those base wines made from vineyard parcels will be transferred directly over to the reserve cellar. So they go into their own tank in literally sort of a dark corner of the cellar, and they'll sit there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years until they get used in a blend. And at the same time, we're taking wines out of the reserve cellar to be used in, for example, right now we're just bottling the classic cuvee based on the 2019 harvest. That will have reserves from previous years incorporated into that. We keep all those. Those reserves are incredibly informative for us, because not only do we have each tank giving us a single vintage, but also a single variety and even a parcel selection. So understanding how they evolve, and we keep a close eye. I mean, you don't need to taste the wine every day, but 4 times a year we go through and taste all the reserves and make notes and see how they're evolving, and trying to anticipate when would be the right time for them to come out of the cellars. Yeah. It keeps recent vintages really active in our mind. But then I'm not sure whether Simon was asking about this, but also, the bottled stock, keeping wine all the way back to 92. Nowadays, the 92 is, and 95, 96, those wines from the early vintages, they're mostly for pleasure. There's not a lot, because just things are so different in terms of the viticulture, in terms of vinification. Now we're working from different soils. There's not a lot that we can say they did this in 1995, so it translates into some action that we can do in 2020. But more recently, where we've got better notes, much more detail available, so that's back from 2007 onwards. Those wines, we do check in on them, and not just for let's see how they're doing and have something delicious today, but actually, where is this wine now? What sort of track is it on, and can we learn anything from that in terms of more recent wines that we're working
on? Next question, really interesting question from Silke, who I think would be interested to hear both of your thoughts on this. Says, what is your opinion of more and more champagne companies buying land, planting vineyards in England for future sparkling wine production? Is this a decision due to climate change? And how come the proud French are now expanding into Great Britain? So Brad, do you want to take the first answer to that?
I love it. I think it's great news, and I think it's a fantastic endorsement for English sparkling wine. I think it's no small thing for champagne houses to come over here and to invest in England, and it makes a great endorsement for what we're doing over here. And another nice thing is it sort of closes a loop in a way, because Nyetimber were the first to do Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier in England for traditional method sparkling, and no question, the people putting those first vines in the ground were inspired by what's happening over in Champagne. And I think now we can say, champagne houses coming this way, Taittinger, Pommery, a few others searching behind the scenes, probably, hopefully, influenced a little bit by what Nyetimber has accomplished, and others, of course, inspired by the overall English wine industry. But I just think that's, makes a really nice, closes a loop, and it's also just thinking, in the wider context, it's an endorsement that almost everybody understands. If you're even peripherally involved in wine, to be able to hear that champagne houses are investing in English sparkling wine, it clicks. You get it, that English sparkling wine is probably something serious.
Yeah, great. And for you, Marc, I'm sure you're aware of this yourself, but do you reckon there's much awareness yet outside of the UK about this movement of champagne? And if so, what do you think the reaction is? Is it the same kind of feeling to what we have here?
I think it's something people are starting to notice, because most of the acquisitions were quite recent, and most of the sparkling wine we see outside of England is still from classic English estates, especially Nyetimber. But I think it's something we know from some other regions too. I mean, there are sparkling estates of champagne producers in California and Tasmania, and also in certain parts of China now. And I think it just shows that due to climate changing, people are looking for new great spots to do that. And I think Brad said that really great, that Champagne, that is of course still very proud Champagne, is now looking into where else can we make the same quality, is showing how excellent the sparkling wines in England are and what potential people see in them, also coming from probably the most famous sparkling wine region in the world.
Great stuff. Thank you. So time for a couple more questions. Nicola asks, going back to the glass, is there a particular glass Nyetimber recommend for our wines? So obviously, Marc, you were talking earlier about how important it is for this. Actually, just before we answer that, just out of curiosity, Marc, what glass is it that you have this evening?
Today it's a white wine glass. In this case, it's from Josephinenhütte. They're quite small producer, but I think there are many great glass producers. There's Riedel, there's Schott-Ziesel, there's Zalto, and I think as long as you have a glass which has a certain amount of air and looks a bit more like a white wine glass than the classic champagne flute, then usually that's a really nice way to present a good sparkling wine.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we feel exactly the same. Brad, have you got, is it Zalto you've got this evening? Or?
Yeah, it is indeed. Yeah. So the Zalto, I guess this is a champagne flute, they call it. And I just, purely by coincidence, but I just noticed over my shoulder is the sweet wine glass, which we use for, that's also Zalto we use for the 1086 wines, which, to your point, Marc, just allows more room for the aromas to develop a slightly bigger bowl. But there are other great other options. Jancis Robinson even has that universal glass with Richard Breton that I think works really well for sparkling. And then Riedel, etc. Some nice options, but just you want something with a little bit of a bowl to let the aromas develop.
Exactly right. Yeah. Okay, so maybe we've got time for one last question. Just before the last answer, though, Silke, whose question I answered before, has just written in to say that her favorite style of music to accompany the bubbles, bossa nova. So I don't know if that's coming up on either of you two, your options, but we shall see. So last question before the final answer, just because we're running a bit low on time, and apologies to any questions we don't get to. As I said, we will get to answering them as soon as possible. Camille has asked a number of questions. I'm just going to pick one, which is about, pardon me, what are our next moves in terms of export and Nyetimber? Brad, perhaps you want to?
Yeah, I think the growth is an important next step. So we've done a good job establishing some markets, Western Europe, in the US, in Asia, well, parts of Asia, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. I think first of all we need to consolidate those efforts and raise awareness of English sparkling wine and of Nyetimber, because it's still a fairly new concept. I think we're really fortunate that English sparkling wine punches above its weight in terms of awareness. There's might be a little bit more English sparkling wine consumed in a year now, but it's something like around, the amount of English sparkling wine that gets opened in a year is not that different to the amount of Dom Perignon that gets opened in a year. That sort of gives you the context for how small we are as an industry. And yet everybody, around the world that's interested in wine is probably nowadays heard of English sparkling wine. So we punch above our weight in terms of awareness, but we really need to get, more established in these markets, spread out beyond just, the really knowledgeable consumers, in the way that do the job that we've had to do in the UK over the last 12 to 15 years, where rewind back to that time in London, it was a special occasion if you could find an English wine on a wine list. Now it's a special occasion, or it looks kind of out of touch if you don't have an English wine on your list. Internationally, that's the job we got to redo all over again. That it's exciting. It's a sign of being avant-garde and knowledgeable if you've got English sparkling wine on your list. But it's still rare. We've got to build that up. With the treading carefully, not to spread ourselves too thinly. Because of that, high awareness, there's demands from all over the world. The easiest thing to do would be just, shipping pallets of English sparkling wine all over the world, answering every demand with some bottles. But if it just sits on the shelf and there's nobody there to tell the story, no sommelier who's been, trained and knows and cares about English sparkling wine, they'll just sit forever. The bottles will just sit forever on the shelf or on the wine list. So, we need to foster the markets that we've established, I think.
Totally. Camille's asked another question, which we won't be able to get to tonight, Camille, but it's a great one, which is saying she's curious to know more about our viticultural philosophy. What I would say, Camille, is this Friday evening, so same time this Friday, I'll be doing another session with Ben Kanzler, who's our viticulturist at Nyetimber. So if you're free on Friday, please do tune in, where the whole session will be about our viticultural philosophy, and we look forward to discussing it. So, gentlemen, that almost wraps us up, but the answer to the question, what song would you pair with our classic cuvee? Marc, do you want to go first?
I've tried to think of the singer, but I can only think of the song. It's called Music Was My First Love. I'm not sure if people know that, and it always changes between quite quiet vocal parts to quite bombastic orchestra parts. And I think that's a bit like when you enjoy a bottle of the classic cuvee, because when you pour it fresh in the glass, it's quite loud, expressive. You have a lot of fizz, you have a little bit of foam, you have quite strong aromas on your nose. And then when it sits there for a couple of minutes and starts to breathe, it becomes a bit more elegant, a bit more delicate, and a bit more quiet. And then you re-pour yourself, and then basically the loop starts again, and it's a bit like that song.
Excellent. I just quickly Googled it. It was a 1976 single by John Miles. You'll be interested to know, of course, that it hit number 3 on the UK singles chart and number 10 on the German singles chart. So successful in both regions.
Cool.
And Brad, your song of choice for the classic.
I'm embarrassed to say I'm completely paralyzed by this question, and I unfortunately I don't have an answer.
Okay. Right. I promise to everybody here that I will spend the next several weeks pressuring Brad into finding a solution for this song. We'll get there in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great question. It's something that, Brad, you said before, and I've heard Sherry say many times, that it's that, for us, Nyetimber wine, it's that blend of the artistic and we're making a bottle of wine, but there's so much more to it than that. There is that emotional side of things.
We've got actually, we've got the wrong person in front of the camera for that question, because Sherry's classical pianist, loves her music, and I'm sure off the top of her head she'd have a great answer to that question. But you're stuck with me, unfortunately.
We'll have Sherry serenading in the background next time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to do this evening. That was really, really, really kind of you. Great session. Again, I would love to keep this going so much longer, but we'll have to cut it short here for now. Thank you very much, everybody who has joined us this evening. As I mentioned before, we've recorded this session, so we will have it up on probably on our YouTube channel before too long, once we've had a chance to upload it. So anybody who wants to review will be able to do that. I've actually had a few questions since I mentioned the next session that we're doing this Friday, which is with Ben, our viticulturalist. If you'd like to join in for that one, please just go to our website. The link is up on there. We'll also be reposting about it on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, any social media. So you'll be able to find us there. And then a couple of weeks after next Friday, we will have Brad back again with myself and with Sherry this time, just to do the next session of these masterclasses. But thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for the questions. As I said, those of you who we haven't been able to get to tonight, we will get to you. We will be able to answer those questions. Thank you to our very special guests, to Marc. Thank you for joining us. And Brad, thank you very much for taking the time, both of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, until the next time, stay safe, stay well, enjoy wine, good wine, wherever it may be, preferably Nyetimber, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you guys. It's been fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Cheers.